Hello. Hi. How's everyone doing? I hope everyone's doing well today. So I'm going to go ahead and start my presentation, Mexican American Studies, Recentering Student Identities and Wellness. My name is Lilliana Patricia Saldaña, and I am an associate professor of Mexican American Studies at the University of Texas at San Antonio. I'm also co-director of the Mas Teachers Academy, and it is a great pleasure to be with everyone here today, sharing space on a Friday afternoon. And I want to begin by first acknowledging, I am in Yanaguana, San Antonio. So I want to acknowledge the Payaya, the people of Yanaguana, and the Tapilanco-Aguiltecans who are native to the South Texas and Northeast Mexico region, who live in occupied territory as San Antonio. I also acknowledge the Carrizo Comecrudo Nation, or the Estocna, whose traditional territory I am living on. The Carrizo Comecrudo are also our past, present, and future caretakers and knowledge keepers of this land that we call San Antonio, that is Yanaguana. I also want to acknowledge the Lipan Apache, Tonkawa, Kickapoo, Comanche, and other Native nations who were displaced from their territories and migrated to these lands during occupation and who care for Mother Earth and maintain their traditional ways. So thank you very much. And it's an honor to be with everyone here today. I don't get to see everyone's face, but I know that we're sharing space and I can feel all the wonderful energy from where I'm at. So I want to begin just with an overview of today's presentation. I will provide a historical overview of MAS and the movement for Mexican American Studies in K-12 schools in Texas, since that is where I work. I know that there is a movement, right, at a national level for ethnic studies, and I know that many other communities have been working hard to get ethnic studies, including Latinx studies, African American studies, Native American and Indigenous studies, and Asian American studies in their classrooms. I also want to talk about the hallmarks of Mexican American studies and ethnic studies and the principles and commitments in Mexican American studies and how these facilitate humanizing practices in and beyond the classroom. And I also want to discuss how these principles and commitments can help us recenter students as they come back to the classroom after such a traumatic year. So the idea is to honor and dignify students through their histories, their realities, and their cultural wealth. Let me go on to the next slide. So it's really, as someone who's been in the contemporary movement for Mexican American studies here in Texas, it really is an honor to kind of look at the bigger picture and the history of ethnic studies, the history of Chicana and Chicano studies, and we now call it Chicanx studies in the United States. As some of you may know, Chicana and Chicano studies emerged out of the civil rights movement of the 1960s and the 1970s. I always begin even before that, right? So when I'm looking at the history of Mexican American education in the United States, specifically in Texas, I always like to talk about the Escuelitas movement, because the Escuelitas movement, right, Escuelitas, or the little schools movement, was really a community response to the racial violence and racial discrimination that Mexican people experienced in the school system and in the larger society, right? The early 1900s, Mexicans were targets of racial violence by the Texas Rangers. They were targets of everyday racism in South Texas and Central Texas. And so while the progressive era, right, introduced public schooling and mandated public schooling, the progressive era also had many racist policies in schools. So working class Mexican communities created their own schools, their own community funded schools called escuelitas to teach Mexican school children or school aged children Mexican history, Mexican culture. It was an attempt to immerse Mexican American children in their history and their culture. It was a way to resist the assimilationist policies of the U.S. public school system. So I always go back to that, and I honor those who paved the way for Mexican American studies 100 years later today. So in the early So in the 1960s, you had a generation of youth who demanded school curricula that was culturally rooted, that honored and recognized the histories of Mexican Americans in the United States. You had youth, basically a coordinating committee of faculty, staff, and students out of the University of Santa Barbara and the UC system who drafted El Plan de Santa Barbara, and they demanded the creation of Chicano studies programs. We now call them Chicana and Chicano studies. Some programs refer to them as Chicanx studies, and here in Texas, we usually use Mexican American studies. But they demanded the creation of a field of study, right? So MAS has existed for 50 years in the United States. In Texas, you had universities like UT Austin who implemented Chicano studies programs during the 1970s. It took other institutions a bit longer to establish these programs. I'm at UTSA, and we've been in existence for 27 years. So we started the MAS program almost 20 years after the Chicano Civil Rights Movement. And it's taken another 15 years, right, or I would say another 30 years, right, to get MAS into our public schools. So growing MAS, right, the contemporary movement for Mexican American studies in Texas has been in existence for about 7-8 years now. And we've been working very hard over the past, 7-8 years to grow MAS in our K through 12 schools, because it's still very much non-existent in many communities. In Texas, more than 51% of school-age children are classified as Hispanic, right? So it's imperative, right, that students and youth have access to ethnic studies, to Mexican American studies. Texas also offers African American studies in some schools, and there is a committee of teachers and parents who are also pushing for Native American and Indigenous studies. So that's really exciting news, and we're hoping that our schools and children and youth have access to this curriculum. So to date, Tucson ISD is the only school district to have successfully implemented a district-wide MAS program. Some of you may be familiar with the MAS movement in Tucson, Arizona, that came under attack more than 10 years ago. The state of Arizona, unfortunately, legislated a policy, legislated law to ban specifically Mexican American studies, not Native American studies, or African American studies. It was specifically targeting Mexican American studies. This was at the same time that Arizona passed the Show Me Your Papers policy, also known as SB 1070. So despite the success of this program, the Mexican American Studies program in the district was pretty much shut down. But it did spur a national movement for ethnic studies. And Texas was very much inspired by the amazing movement that teachers and students and parents led in that community. And so in Texas, we've been growing MAS at the State Board of Education, right, from our advocacy there to working with teachers on the ground to develop curricula, right, to develop curricula, to to really develop a pedagogy that reflects the community and the struggles of our community, and that reflects the field of Mexican American studies, right? Unfortunately, many educators in the United States go through teacher education programs that are not rooted in ethnic studies, right? Many of the teachers, for example, teaching MAS in San Antonio, some of them do have a background in Mexican American studies. They either studied Mexican American studies and earned an undergraduate degrees, or they have graduate degrees in MAS. But many have not had a background or have taken courses in MAS. So the work that we're doing to provide that professional development that is rooted in MAS pedagogy and curriculum development is really important. So I do want to talk about the hallmarks of Mexican American studies, right? What are the principles of Mexican American studies? What are the commitments that the field has to education? What are the commitments that MAS has to our children and our youth, right? What are the commitments that we have to educators who are also learning in the process? So these are the 7 hallmarks that I'm going to focus on. And these are actually hallmarks that Christine Slater and Miguel Zavala talk about in their book called Transformative Ethnic Studies in Schools, Curriculum, Pedagogy, and Research. This is really an amazing book that covers the foundations of ethnic studies. So I use this as a framework for Mexican American studies. Many scholars in the field of Mexican American studies have actually written on many of these hallmarks and many of these commitments. So the first commitment that I'd like to talk about is curriculum as counter-narrative. So MAS reframes the narrative of school knowledge to center the narratives of Mexican immigrant and Mexican American communities and other communities of color. It doesn't tokenize these narratives within the dominant narratives, right? Oftentimes we might find ourselves only talking about Mexican communities or other Latinx communities during Hispanic Heritage Month, for example. But MAS really asks that we as educators center these narratives, because for too long, these narratives have been erased, ignored, distorted, omitted, and conveniently silenced. Schools usually only add bits of pieces of our history and cultural knowledge in the curriculum. So MAS really explicitly centers our epistemologies, right? Our bodies of knowledge, the bodies of knowledge that inform our ways of being in the world, that embodies our perspectives and our worldviews. So MAS explicitly centers our body of knowledge that includes Indigenous, working class, and queer histories, right? That point to our personal and collective struggles within the context of US settler colonialism and nation building. And I think that's really important that we be specific about what MAS centers, right? The working class histories, the histories of those who have been most invisible in the curriculum, those who continue to be the most marginalized in our society, in our communities. So it's really about going beyond, right? The 1 month people of color months, right? Like Hispanic Heritage Month or Black History Month or Pride Month. It's about creating a curriculum that counters the dominant narrative. And if you live in the state of Texas or other states, you'll know that this is an ongoing epistemic, curricular, and political project, particularly because of the repressive policies that expect that educators reify the settler colonial narratives and colonial myth making in our teaching and in our curriculum. Another idea that I'd like to point out is that MAS and ethnic studies is not about teaching about Mexican Americans, right? Because I think that sometimes we might get caught up in, oh, we need to teach about these historical figures and these historical dates, and then we need students to memorize them because they're in the standards, or they might not even be in the standards. And so it's not about inundating our students with these dates, right, and the historical figures. It's about creating a curriculum that cultivates a deep understanding of how Mexican Americans and other people of color define themselves and the world around them. It's about engaging our students in a historical analysis of systems of privilege and oppression to disrupt the white hegemonic worldview that dominates the curriculum, right? So what would it look like, to teach about the US-Mexico War from the perspective, right? From a Mexican-American studies perspective. If you teach African-American studies, what would that perspective look like when you're teaching about the US-Mexico War? Right? How would that perspective look like when you're centering the perspective of Black communities, right? Of Black people? What would that perspective look like, or what would that history look like when you're centering the perspective of Indigenous people, right? If you're teaching about the US-Mexico War, what would that look like in the classroom if you're centering the perspective of Indigenous people, right? So MAS is really about centering or centering these counter narratives of communities of color, right? It takes the perspective of the people that students are learning about. So we must center these counter narratives more than ever, because textbooks continue to convey a perspective and narrative that sanitizes racial injustice in the past and also racial injustice in the present. This occurs through many processes, but mainly by not problematizing white narratives, right, that exclude people of color and the global majority. I think it's also important to connect the past with the present through these counter narratives. For example, we may talk about the consequences of the US-Mexico War and how it impacted Mexican people in the past, right? Because they were displaced, they were expelled, and oftentimes they were victims of state-sanctioned violence. But we may not always connect the past with how settler colonialism continues to play out in the lives of our communities today, right? How does this history play out in the lives of working class Mexican people, right? Through the construction of the border wall, through these senseless deportations, through racial profiling, police violence, right? The ongoing anti-Mexican racial violence that many in our communities continue to experience on a daily basis. So those are some of the main ideas that I wanted to share on MAS as a counter-narrative curriculum. Whether you're teaching MAS or if you're teaching Latinx studies or African American studies, Indigenous studies, ethnic studies requires that we write our curriculum, right? That we develop, that we create curricula from the perspectives of people who have been oppressed by racism and colonization, right? So grounding the curriculum in the perspectives of people of color, right? Grounding that curriculum in people of color standpoints facilitates the creation of counter narratives that offer historical accounts and interpretations that question the dominant narratives. So counter narratives in the curriculum should center the perspectives and epistemologies of those who are not in the curriculum. So when you look at it this way, MAS and other ethnic studies areas really demand fundamental changes to the curriculum, right? So it's not about just adding on. It really is about making those fundamental changes. MAS also reroutes ancestral knowledge and traditions and ways of knowing and being in the classroom. And this is why I wanted to include this image. I don't think I included the information for this image, but it's this is an art piece by Carmen Lomas Garza, who is a South Texas artist who chronicles the everyday cultural traditions and experiences of working class Mexican American communities, right? So this is a tamalada, right? A gathering, a family gathering of people making tamales, which is really an ancestral tradition. It's a tradition that is thousands of years old, that despite colonization and US settler colonialism, we have been able to maintain in our families. So Mas reroots our students in that ancestral knowledge and the traditions, right? The tradition, the ancestral ways of knowing, the ancestral ways of being, right? So it's knowing about tamales, right? But it's also the ancestral ways of being, right? Of creating in community with community. So colonization was really about erasing the knowledge of Black and Indigenous people on this continent. So a lot of what we've been doing in Mas is recovering, reclaiming, recentering ancestral knowledge and histories. For example, in Arizona, when Arizona created its Mexican American Studies program, you had teachers like Mictlani Gonzalez, who began to develop Mas or anchor Mas within an Indigenous epistemological framework. In other words, their Mas program centered Indigenous knowledge, Indigenous perspectives that then really became their pedagogy, right? It's not just the content that they taught, it was about how they engaged their students in teaching and learning in the classroom, right? So I always refer to their Nawi Olim. Mictlani Gonzalez is also part of the Shito Institute. So according to Mictlani Gonzalez, who created this indigenous pedagogy and methodology, Nawi Olim, and I'm quoting her, represents the cyclical movement of nature with respect to the four directions, right? The four directions in Mexica worldview and other indigenous worldviews. The phrase comes from the Nahuatl language, Nawi meaning four and Olim meaning movement. Nawi Olim is a fundamental concept in Aztec Mexica cosmology, a guide for everyday life and decisions. The objective is to constantly strive for balance, especially when there is a struggle. Nawi Olim uses ancestral cultural concepts representing community, knowledge, education, willpower, transformation, and most importantly, self-introspection, right? So this is the framework that they brought to their Mas curriculum, and it served as a counter narrative to not just what students learn, but how they learn. Okay, so this is just I'm always so amazed by the curriculum that they develop from the ground up, drawing from this ancestral knowledge. So I'm also thinking of Maya Nawa concepts that were also adapted into the Mas curriculum in Arizona. And I know that many Mexican American studies and ethnic studies programs across the country use, for example, Maya Nawa concepts like in Lakech, which means you are my other, you are my other me, right? Like respecting you means that I respect myself. If I love you, I love myself, right? It's this idea of mutuality, right? And cultivating those relationships in the classroom based on respect, reciprocity, mutuality, solidarity, and truth seeking, right? So I'd be very happy to share more of those resources with you. But the idea is that reclaiming ancestral knowledge and traditions and epistemologies is really an important part of countering the narrative in the curriculum. With that being said, I think it's also important to center Afro-Chicanx histories as well as to not perpetuate anti-Blackness, right? We want to really center the experiences of all our students. It took Mexico almost 500 years to even recognize that there was a Black root in Mexico, right? That there was a Black root to Mexican history and Mexican culture. And we're now seeing a lot of Afro-Latinx scholars and teachers and Afro-Chicanx scholars and teachers who, and not only teachers, but also writers and artists who are challenging these dominant narratives of identity and history, even within the field of Mexican American studies. So it's really exciting to see how we're amplifying our understanding and our consciousness, right? And what it means to bring these counter narratives to the classroom. The other hallmark that I want to focus on is criticality, right? Because criticality takes a critical, MAS is about creating a critical stance in the curriculum. It's about taking a critical stance in our classrooms. According to Miguel Zavala, criticality has to do with seeking knowledge that helps to liberate people from oppressive circumstances, right? So it's about creating that critical consciousness that Paulo Freire talks about in his book, Pedagogy of the Oppressed, right? It's about creating a critical understanding of the world. It's about cultivating critical analysis in the classroom. It's about questioning unjust relations of power. It means dismantling hegemonic structures in our society, right? But in order to dismantle those hegemonic structures, we have to develop, right? We have to cultivate that criticality within ourselves as educators and that criticality with our students in the classroom. So this really requires that as educators, right, that we name the systems of privilege and oppression, that we create spaces in the classroom so students get to question why these systems of oppression even exist to begin with, and that we work towards envisioning alternatives away from these oppressive systems like capitalism, like heteropatriarchy and racism. And I say this because racism and white supremacy are rarely, if not ever, mentioned in our textbooks. They're not mentioned in curricular standards, right? State standards. So it's really, important that we create that criticality in the classroom, because even though racism and white supremacy they're barely mentioned in our textbooks and they're barely mentioned even in curricular standards, it's at the foundation of this society. And it's important that we cultivate that criticality so our students decolonize, so our students have the ability to resist, and they have the ability to transform these systems of oppression. I also want to add, right, that in cultivating, nurturing, facilitating this criticality, that we're not only providing ourselves and our students with the skills that we need to begin to chip away at these structures, but it's also a process of rehumanization, right? The process of being able to think critically about our world, right? To name the systems of privilege and oppression that we confront on a daily basis is also a rehumanizing practice. And it's really important for our students to be able to develop this lens, right? This critical lens. And oftentimes, if you teach Mexican American studies, if you teach ethnic studies, you'll begin to hear your students express how they feel, right? Because they will have a response to this new knowledge, right? They're learning these counter narratives, and now they're developing this lens, right, to question the world. They're now asking critical questions related to power, and for many students, right, in my experience, it's a healing process, right? It's a healing process to be able to question, particularly because I would say the quote unquote traditional approach to education has been a banking approach, right? Where they're not learning, they're memorizing and they're regurgitating. And they're disengaged from the learning process, and they're also disengaged from their communities and the world. So criticality is an important part of Mexican American studies and really any ethnic studies program and curriculum. The other hallmark that I want to focus on is reclaiming cultural identities. This is a key element of Mexican American studies. As I mentioned earlier, MAS is not traditional social studies where students are learning key historical figures and they're memorizing dates, because it's not a traditional academic curriculum. MAS is about centering students' cultural identities. It's where students can see themselves reflected in the curriculum. You know, as I mentioned earlier, our communities are dealing with 500 years of colonization, 500 years of genocide, and institutionalized forms of racism, which have led to the erasure of their identities, right, over the generations. So they're dealing with a lot of trauma. They're dealing with a lot of loss. And schools have played a key role in perpetuating that violence, right? And I often refer to this as a form of spiritual violence, right? It is a form of spiritual violence when our schools do not create spaces where students can reclaim their cultural identities. So schools have played a key role, right, in erasing students' identities. It's a process that Joel Spring refers to as deculturalization. Chicana education scholars like Angela Valenzuela have written extensively on this process, and she calls this subtractive schooling. And it's the many ways in which schools divest young people of their identities and their knowledge. She, in her book called Subtractive Schooling, she writes about how Mexican immigrant and Mexican American youth were delinked, severed from their histories and cultural practices, right? Their identities. So MAS always begins with students' culture, right? What they bring to the classroom, and it's about seeing their culture as an asset rather than as a deficit to their learning and academic success in the classroom, right? So it's really about bringing in, right, not just honoring their cultural identities and their cultural knowledge, but sustaining them, right? That's why I always like this concept of cultural sustaining pedagogies, right? It's about sustaining who students are and the cultural knowledge that they bring to the classroom, including elder epistemologies. And elder epistemologies includes the knowledge that, for example, indigenous communities have sustained over generations. So one thing that I do in the classroom is I have students do oral histories with people in the community, including elders, right? It's important to sustain that knowledge, right? And for students, for youth, right, to sustain their cultural identities and to learn and to recover those histories and the cultural knowledge that is in our community and that is often invisible in the classroom. The other hallmark that I'd like to share, that I'd like to discuss, is intersectionality and multiplicity. MAS recognizes that students' identities are not fixed, right? Student identities are in constant motion as they navigate multiple worldviews and experiences. I'm thinking of the work of Gloria Ansaldúa, who talked about borderlands, right? That people of the US, Mexico, borderlands region constantly navigate multiple worlds, right? Multiple worldviews, multiple experiences. So intersectionality is at the heart of a MAS curriculum and really any ethnic studies curriculum. So what is intersectionality? Intersectionality is the relationships among multiple dimensions and modalities of social relations and subject formations. MAS does not only focus on race and racism, right? It also focuses on social class, right? The way that social class and gender intersects in the lives of women. I'm thinking of the work of Chicana feminists like Gloria Ansaldúa, who was very much influenced by Black feminists, Asian American feminists, and Native American feminist intellectuals. She and other Chicana feminists theorized the ways in which Chicanas, particularly queer Chicanas, experience the world differently than white women and brown men. She also writes about the ways in which language shaped these intersectional identities, right? As well as how geographic region, transborder experiences, gender and sexual orientation and social class all shaped how she experienced the world that was different from others, even within her own community, right? So Mas makes an intentional effort to examine these social identities and how these social identities are connected to systems and structures in our society. So it's really important that we nurture or that we cultivate these spaces for students to understand intersectionality, right? To understand that, you know, Mexican Americans are not are not the same, right? There's heterogeneity within the community, right? Communities, even within, for example, I'm in Yanaguana, San Antonio. Even the experiences of Mexican American communities within the city are different, right? If you live on the South Side, you're going to have a different social experience than, you know, Mexican working class communities in the West Side of San Antonio, right? So it's important that we be mindful of intersectionality in the curriculum and in our classroom practices. I also like that Miguel Zavala focuses on multiplicity. And multiplicity refers to how racial and ethnic groups interact with one another, right? So even though I teach Mexican American studies and I center the experiences of Mexican American people, I want my students to understand multiplicity, right? I want them to understand how Mexican Americans in the United States have interacted, for example, with the Black communities, right? In Texas, in San Antonio. I want them to understand their history in relation to the history of Blacks in the United States, of Blacks in San Antonio, right, in Yanaguana. It's important to create that intersectionality, that multiplicity, because it nurtures solidarity in the ethnic studies curriculum. I also want to talk about community engagement, right? Because community engagement is really at the center of MAS. MAS emerged from social struggle. It actually emerged from student activism, right? From the activism of students who were very much activists in the community. So ethnic studies, and it doesn't really matter what ethnic studies curriculum you're looking at, it will center community, right? Community engagement is a central part of an ethnic studies curriculum, and it's definitely a central part of MAS. And it's central because of the social justice, right, components. MAS is rooted in social justice, in a social justice philosophy. It's about bridging schools, right? It's about bridging what they're learning in the classroom with their experiences in the community. It's about bridging community and schools. So this is why MAS and other ethnic studies are considered, you know, not just an educational, you know, curriculum, but a political project, because pedagogy and curriculum stretch outside of the classroom, right? For example, in my MAS classes, I often, you know, not particularly during this year because of the pandemic, but I'll take my students to, you know, different community centers, to community gardens. They'll participate in mural tours. Some of them actually participating in creating murals in the community. So it's important to think about ways to engage in students in the community, right? And so when I'm looking at the work that's been done in Arizona, many of the teachers engaged in youth participatory action research, where students were doing research themselves in the community. And they were presenting their findings to the community. And oftentimes their research projects were about doing something with the community, right? Improving their communities or contributing to their communities in some way, right? So community engagement is really based on this idea of engaging your students as advocates, as leaders, as researchers in the community. It's about nurturing those grassroots projects. And in this way, MAS ruptures the traditional models of curriculum development, where everything is just in the classroom and it's also teacher-centered, right? Moss really pushes teachers to think outside of that teacher-centeredness and to think about community and to think about students. Because community is at the center of a Moss curriculum, it also grounds students in their lived experiences and community ways of knowing, right? What are the ways in which communities engage with each other, right? How can we bring that into the classroom? Okay. I know that some of us have heard about culturally responsive curriculum, culturally relevant curriculum, but this is also a hallmark, right, of Mexican American studies. And it's in opposition to teaching as transmission of content. And I know I've talked about that with some of the other concepts. Because there is a difference between teaching Moss content, which is like historical figures, historical dates, and knowing how to teach Moss, right? Because Moss is a pedagogy. It's not content, right? Moss is not content. Ethnic studies is not about content. It is about pedagogy. And it means that we shift from teacher-centered teaching approaches to student-centered and community-centered approaches to teaching and learning, right? So at the heart, right, of culturally responsive and culturally mediated pedagogies is really focusing on students and who they are, what they bring to the classroom, what engages their interest and imaginations, and how the community cultural wealth students bring might be leveraged to promote academic learning, right? The concept of community cultural wealth comes from a Chicano studies scholar by the name of Tarayoso. And she is reconceptualizing what wealth means, right, from a social capital perspective. Oftentimes, the discourse in our schools is very deficit oriented. I remember when I was doing my research in a school, a working class community here in San Antonio, I would often hear, especially early childhood teachers, describe their students as like they don't have language, they don't know their number, or they don't know their letters. They don't speak in the classroom, right? They were talking about pre-kinder 3 and pre-kinder 4 children. So Tarayoso's community cultural wealth framework really challenges us to rethink and reframe our students as holders and creators of knowledge, as human beings who bring a breadth of wealth to the classroom, including aspirational capital, which is maintaining hopes and dreams in the face of barriers, right? Our students bring familial capital, which is the cultural knowledge developed within the family over generations, right? They also bring navigational capital, which includes the skills and maneuvering through institutions, right? They know how to navigate their communities, and they bring that knowledge to our classrooms. And oftentimes we don't recognize that and we don't honor that. Students also bring resistant capital, which is knowledge and skills they've developed through challenging inequality. And this is really important. They also bring linguistic capital, which is the intellectual and social skills attained through communication in more than one language, right? Oftentimes I would hear teachers say, oh, they don't bring language. What they were trying to say is that they didn't speak English, right? And because they didn't speak English, they saw them as not having language, right? And our students bring a vast, right, a breadth of linguistic capital to the classrooms. So this is a framework that is really will really help us develop culturally responsive and culturally mediated pedagogies. So this is all I have for right now. If you have any questions, I'd be very happy to answer them. I believe that I don't know if people want to ask questions in the chat. I just realized I had one more slide. And it goes back to the idea of students as intellectuals, right? That we treat our students as holders and creators of knowledge, to quote from Chicana feminist education scholar Dolores Delgado Bernal. Our students are holders of knowledge. They're creators of knowledge. They're not just memorizing information, right? Which is what is often done in the classroom. They are learning, they hold knowledge, and they create knowledge. So this is a way to shift from looking at Mas and ethnic studies as like fun and cultural courses, right? I mean, we want our students to be engaged and we want them to feel safe, right? We want them to feel welcomed. But Mas is also about nurturing intellectualism within our students. It's about respecting what our students bring to the classroom, right? Their experiences and their capacity to critically reflect and develop their own understanding of the world. So as you're developing your curricula, as you're thinking about how you teach in the classroom, right, your own pedagogy, it's important to think, okay, am I positioning students as intellectuals in the classroom? Am I relating to students as intellectuals in the classroom? I'd be very happy to answer any questions at this moment, or if you want to share any insights. I see Velma. Velma, it's so good to see you. Thank you for joining. I always learn from you. Thank you, Velma. I know that there are, the ethnic studies movement in the United States is growing. I know that, for example, California, has a strong ethnic studies movement across their regions. Some schools are offering ethnic studies, right, especially in communities that are that have students from different backgrounds, right? They also have raza studies or mas. Some schools also have African American studies, Asian and Pacific Islander studies. Colorado, I think right now is in the process of getting school boards to adopt Mexican American studies. The same thing in New Mexico. There are a few high school teachers that are teaching Mexican American studies. I know Kansas and Topeka, there's a teacher who teaches, Jackie Madrigal, she teaches Latinx literature. And here in San Antonio, there are at least, and it's growing every year, we have at least 25 high school teachers teaching Mexican American studies, which is really historic because we've never had Mexican American studies in our K through 12 schools until about 3 years ago, right? And we're also growing mas in the middle school grades. There's, I think, at least 4 or 5 middle schools in San Antonio that are going to be offering mas as of this fall. And I am also working with elementary school teachers who are integrating mas across content areas, right? And social studies and language arts and math, right? They're teaching students Aztec ethnomathematics in their math classes, right? So, you know, it's really about centering, right? Whether it's math, whether it's African American studies, whether it's indigenous studies, but centering that in the curriculum and in our classroom praxis. And Leticia, I read your comment. I especially appreciate that one of the goals of this type of approach is to foster students' intellectualism, because it allows us to interrogate established notions of scholarship and who gets to tell their stories. Yes, absolutely. Thank you, Leticia. Yes, and this is where we're really bringing students as holders and creators of knowledge, right? They're the ones who are chronicling their community's histories, right? Their barrio histories, their family histories. I have my students document their family histories over 4 generations. And that's always a powerful exercise because they get to document their family histories. And I think one of the positive things about MAS, right? And I don't know that anyone's written about this, is that as students are doing this research, right? They're asking their parents about the grandparents, or that maybe they're asking their grandparents about the great grandparents, right? They're also documenting like their migration histories over 4 generations, their language practices over 4 generations, and looking at patterns of language loss, language acquisition. They're looking at patterns of employment over 4 generations and how these patterns of like employment are connected to structural or the segmented economy, right? It's connected to the creation of a racialized dual wage economy, especially in Texas, where Mexicans had, you know, the low status jobs, the low paying jobs, because of education, right? And they're also looking at education patterns over 4 generations, right? They're connecting this to the social histories that they're learning about. But yes, it's about cultivating that intellectualism. And they get to tell the stories. They get to write the counter narratives. And they can do this in many ways, right? It's not just writing it down, but maybe they want to write a song. Maybe they want to produce an art piece, right? And that is also, you know, part of our creation resistance. It's getting us to think outside of the traditional models of education. You know, documenting our family histories. Even I've seen, you know, indigenous communities continue to tell the stories of their communities through textile making. So how can we create those spaces that challenge the often violent approaches that we use, right, in our schools? And how can we create spaces that are healing and nurturing and empowering for our students? So I don't know if Fabiola is still there. I think I have like 5 more minutes. I don't know if people are able to use the chat. This is kind of a new platform for me.